This water tech company solves a real daunting challenge faced by some of the most trendy and well-capitalized companies in the world. Think of it.
We have a horrible wastewater. And what do we do with it? You stick it in a truck, drive it halfway across to the country to somewhere that nobody particularly cares about, and then you dump it in the ground? Is that the best that we can do? Is that the best that we can do? And it's literally a car crash waiting to happen.
It got recommended to me by one of the finest experts in water tech's growth stage.
Greg Newblum from MembrIon would be another one. It's a kind of founder like him that's got a novel technology and solution, but is also thinking creatively about the story around decarbonization.
It ticked all my excitement boxes when I interviewed its CEO and founder 2 years ago, and then proceeded to raise a Series B with Samsung and Lam on the cap table, led by Pure Terra Ventures, one of the very few dedicated water VCs. Yet, when I went to Pure Terra's LP days earlier this year, Nick Panequet, who also sits on MembrIon's board, blew me out of the water when he reviewed the VC's portfolio companies. To him, and that's me probably poorly paraphrasing, MembrIon was a slow pupil that might graduate, but clearly sits in the back of the room, which Alex Crowell, another partner at Pure Terra Ventures, summarized for me with:
if you were to look at the potential of the company, 8, 9 out of 10. If you were to look at the actions of the company at the time of investment and the focus on the right things, it was probably 1.5 out of 10.
So why would a company I would classify in the top tier of the about 200 I interviewed deserve a 1.5 out of 10? Why does it matter to acknowledge, next to what they're awesome at, where they have room for improvement? How was the company's path over the last 18 months, full of high highs and low lows? What did it take to shape up for growth? After interviewing the key players at MembrIon and relentlessly tracking their progress, I'm here to show you how, yes, you read that title right, I'm confident they will scale to $50 million annual recurring revenue if they don't get acquired before that. This is MembrIon's growth story.
Knowing what I know now, would I enthusiastically rehire this person?
Am I re-interviewing for my job?
Happy being the sidekick.
Is Greg the right guy for that?
We may or may not be here in 2 years.
Oh, goodbye. It's gone. If we said no to everything that raised a red flag, we wouldn't be MembrIon.
And that's the easiest way for a company to die.
What about Chewbacca, though?
Some of that process is really painful.
I think with my hair, I'll claim that one.
It's a growth story. One of the fundamental issues that we heard from everybody was, you guys have this amazing new technology. We consistently in pilots would prove that we could hit targets that, people didn't believe were possible. But then we get a very reasonable question, which is, okay, if we drop a big check to put this piece of capital equipment in place, how do we guarantee that you are still going to be around in 2 years when we need a new set of membranes? And there fundamentally is no good answer to that question other than, trust me, we will be here. We're building references, all that sort of stuff. For a big company, that's a huge risk to take on a new technology is, are we going to be there? And so I think one of the fundamental things we realized within that is no matter what, we were going to have to take on the risk of existing.
That is where our growth story starts for today, roughly at the time I released my first interview with Greg on the podcast in January of 2023, when MembrIon took the risk of existing by raising a $12.5 million Series B led by Pure Terra Ventures.
The capital that was raised for MembrIon was to position them for growth, to understand the company's capabilities, to give them 18 to 24 months run, to put people in key positions, and to get the product ready for the client. Now, the latter part of this, what I would refer to as putting your child on the school bus, getting that tech off bench and out into the real world, it's a scary endeavor because you no longer have anything to hide. It's out there. You have to perform. The ingredients have to match what's written on the tin.
With an advanced material, the possibilities are endless.
It's hard to say where it doesn't work. There's definitely areas where it won't work as long.
And if you don't fully commit to one thing, you can never actually be wrong. You can say, okay, well, we're doing all these different things and we've got all these different irons in the fire and something is going to hit. Something is going to be really good. But if you have to say well, we're only going to bet on one, well, then you better be right.
When we were starting, we were casting a pretty broad net because we just needed to figure out like what we could do. I sort of made like a list of here's all the chemical species we've come across to date, and this is what has happened when we've tested it to date. So I do have like a big library that I've sort of created so that other people can like go faster through those learning cycles. We'll be asked like, hey, can you do this? And I'll go to the literature and see, has anyone else tried this? And oftentimes it's like maybe one person in a study that didn't actually really know how the system worked, but I can go and look and see. At some point, you have to do the thing. You can't just wait until you have perfect information.
The worst case scenario is that you launch a technology too early and it goes out and it fails. However, at the same time, you're also not out there looking for the $5 to $10 million projects. You want a bunch of base hits here. Like you take this tech, you put it out, low flows, you stress it. That's the hard part with material science. It's not a light switch. You can't put it on a robot and turn it on and off a million times in 20 minutes or 5 minutes or 30 seconds and say, okay, this thing's going to last for the next 40 years. It's a learn by bleeding. At some point, you have to put your product out.
I was afraid of being wrong in particular because I think in water, it often takes a year to figure out if you're wrong. Getting something through in a new market in less than a year, very hard. Build enough information that we were even right in what we were focusing on was going to take a year. And if you're wrong, well, then you are out of money and you were wrong. And that's the easiest way for a company to die, right? Especially as at the stage that we're at where you do have to be growing revenue, you have to be growing bookings. I was afraid that if we pick the wrong thing, it's basically game over. It's your last chance, right? Now, whether that's true or not, who knows? But that's certainly a fear in that process.
I bucket technologies only in 3 buckets: jewelry, aspirin, or oxygen. This was the pause that we had with MembrIon, because at that point, they were jewelry. And what we need to ascertain is, can we get them from jewelry through the aspirin phase to oxygen?
One of the requirements that they came in with on that round is they said, we love the technology, we love what you're doing, but you guys need to go through this program, which is called Rockefeller Scaling Up.
Scaling Up is a program that we use that we take all of the key or senior people in the company, we put them in one room, and we force feed them the red pill. They have no choice but to see what's actually there instead of what they wish was there. So we strip it all down. We've seen some long lines in the sand from the heel marks of people who resisted it.
I don't want to go in there. It sucks.
And after the fact, the ones that have really embraced it, it's interwoven throughout the company fabric.
How do you start applying a much more kind of rigorous strategic thinking to what you're doing, moving from kind of the optimistic, we can do everything, let's be scrappy, let's figure it out, to putting really clear plans, targets in place, and then executing on those plans?
I think it definitely did change our focus, especially my team. Very early on, especially as an R&D organization, we looked to a lot of government grants for funding, and we did a lot of projects that were government funded. That kind of defined my role for a long time, was managing the grants, getting new grants. And after the B round, something that Greg and I talked about is, let's make sure that our best people are focused on our immediate problems right now, and not necessarily the technology advancements that the government is looking to fund. It's no longer our stage. And so a big thing for me was actually kind of stepping away, in a way, again, I guess, from academia and that kind of cadence, and really focusing on what are MembrIon's needs, what are the priorities, and then having the internal resources to manage that.
When we first came to MembrIon, they were focused, but not necessarily on the right things. Another coat of polish, maybe we color it blue instead of green, or, all of these little tweaks. Oh, let's just try it again. Eventually, as I said, you got to put your child on a school bus and send it down the road and see how it performs. It's just the nature of the beast. If you were to look at the potential of the company, 8, 9 out of 10. If you were to look at the actions of the company at the time of investment and the focus on the right things, it was probably 1.5 out of 10, 2 out of 10, somewhere in that area. Not to say they were doing the wrong things, they were just doing too many things. That results in a lot of chaos on being focused and moving in the right direction.
We did have this conversation with them around we don't have enough information to commit today, but we can get that information over a 3-month period and we can get to that point. And so we did a bunch of market research. We hired people who had, more expertise, were able to add in input into that process.
Is it the right time? Are we ready? Do we have, I think every technology has to ask, do we have all of our, ducks in a row? And at some point, you got to just take a leap of faith. And so I did feel that tension. What I took on kind of as my part during this past time, where we were maybe slowing down, getting ready for growth, is do we really have the product understanding we need to grow? Are we ready to put a bunch of stuff in the field? And what can I and my team think about and questions we can answer on the front end to really make sure that once we grow, we have that solid foundation to grow from. So it felt more like eating before a big growth spurt. It's a terrible analogy, but we were kind of doing a lot of that prep work.
There were a few turning points to MembrIon's track over the last couple of years, one of which scaling up had a lot to do with where they were able to identify what they should be concentrating on and what's important. There's a real confusion between urgence and importance and understanding what takes you down the path and what's just putting out fires.
There is a process, but there's also a moment where you have enough data to have that conviction. You want to build that consensus and not commit too early, but then at some point it's like you can see that the pieces are coming together and there's enough of the pieces that are together that you're like, okay, I can see what the puzzle looks like. We don't need to keep gathering everything to make it whole. We can start going where we're going.
Now, to go where MembrIon was going, you can't do it alone. You need to gather a crew for this rocket.
One of the things that we've identified as a weakness for MembrIon is that we are constantly doing things for the first time. We are really great at learning here, but ideally, I think that one of the things that I noted 18 months ago when we started this scaling up process that I mentioned, we are a water company and we have one person on the team with any experience in the water industry.
When I started, we were still doing batteries, so I was actually the first person to go and figure out how do we take our membranes into the water space. Greg was just sort of like, hey, we want to do this space. Go figure out how to do this space. At the beginning, I did just put the water into our system and see what happens, just because I could learn, because it was a small enough bench scale that I'm like, okay, if I break it, I break it, and let's just see what happens.
If he dies.
As we've broken things and learned better, it becomes a lot easier to be like, okay, I know that if I see this species in the water quality, I'm going to have to think through X, Y, Z things.
When I joined, the whole team was just material scientists, energy nerds, even myself included at that time. The biggest change is really seeing how we're able to take all of that fundamental knowledge and excitement about bringing new technology to market and doing good in the world, and then transferring that to water, and then bringing in the people who actually understand that space.
One of the goals that I set is within 3 years, I want to see 40% of our team have outside experience in the water industry. And I believe right now we are sitting at about 30% a year and a half in. So we're well on track to having that goal, but that's been a big shift for us is how do we not do everything the first time? There are great people who have done this before and have had success. How do we leverage that? And so I think for us, it's really been a lot of team building and getting the right people in the right places.
The headhunter called in, I guess it was Q4 of last year, and basically said, we have an extremely well-funded water startup. They're in Seattle. They're looking for somebody to take over the role. My role is Chief Operating Officer, and more recently with Greg's blessing, I'm taking on the CFO role as well. My role within Chief Operating Officer, I always describe it as you do everything the CEO doesn't want to do. And so right now it's really mostly production, and then I've been doing all the finance work as well.
When the company started, I was in the lab, wearing the lab coat, making membranes, doing all this.
Luckily, he stays very busy. So he doesn't try to come in the crib too much.
And now I see our product development data in an hour of it in the monthly update that kind of goes out to the whole company. Here's the top level stuff that we're doing. And I am very part of what I love is watching other people grow and become wildly successful. For me, it's as fun watching someone like Emily step into a leadership role and be able to just crush it, and me be able to say I don't think I could add much to this. She's knocking it out of the park. I don't need to watch over her shoulder. In many cases, she's probably better than me.
Greg has given me a ton of freedom and bandwidth, and I think it's actually just been a real asset to have a CEO who does understand the technology, because there are moments where I really need him to understand a fundamental technical piece that's going to make something he might say more difficult than he thinks it is. And the nice thing is I don't have to convince him for very long. He gets it really quick.
PureTerra Ventures led our Series B. I connect with them regularly, at least every other week. One of the things that they were able to do is to say, like, I know someone who could be really good at this. And Josh Summers is here partially because he was well connected with PureTerra, and PureTerra said, like, hey, you should take a look at what MembrIon is doing.
We are water specific and we're entering as an investor. We know this industry. We can backfill these positions. We can fortify these early stage companies, MembrIon, with staff that can be brought in at the right time.
We were able to get someone who's deployed hundreds of systems in the field to come in and help lead our early commercial deployments. And that's been transformative for the business. And that starts with me being able to say, I have a problem. It's not a today problem, but it's a 9 months from now problem. Help me solve this. One of the pieces of advice that I got over the last 18 months that really stuck with me is, and I do this every 3 months, I kind of look at my leadership team and I say, knowing what I know now, would I enthusiastically rehire this person? And if it's not a yes, then it's time to change. And right now, everyone on that team is an absolute yes.
I would love to think that the CEO of that startup would be somebody who's exited, 5 or 6 companies in the water industry. That's just not going to happen. The founders, they're PhDs. They're not MBAs. What we look for is the ability for the leadership team to take care of the stage that they're in.
I'm learning all this for the first time. Everyone that's in this with me, they're having to endure my learning curve. And I would like to think that I'm a fast learner, and I made sure that I have really wise people around me that are helping me step up quickly. But if we get to a point as a company where I am holding back the growth instead of helping to accelerate the growth, then it will be time for me to step into a different role.
We look at the senior management of the company the same way we look at ourselves. We take a position in MembrIon as a board member. We as well know that at some point in this company's trajectory, we will need to step down as a board member because we've outrun our usefulness. We're willing to step down, and we would expect the same from a CEO when the company outruns them. For MembrIon, today is certainly not that day. We don't see it in the future yet, but I would say that at some point, say we were a 30, 50 million ARR company, is Greg the right guy for that? He very well may be. He may grow just as fast as the company in his abilities.
And I don't have any qualms with doing that. I don't want to do it. I'm not planning to do it, but I recognize that it requires a certain level of discipline and growth from me to be able to have the privilege of being in this role.
The Series B brought fuel for the rocket, and MembrIon now has a crew. But where is it heading? It's time to focus, I guess.
Really, what's changed for us is our ability to focus and really knowing where to focus. Where can we excel? Where are we fundamentally differentiated from the existing offering? And then how do we double down on those bets?
When to say no is always interesting for a earlier stage company because we want to say yes to everything, but I think there's a certain power in saying no.
Okay, we're actually now just doing one thing. But is it just one thing? Are there not as many unique, interesting, nuanced things to find about this specific thing? I think that's like kind of the beauty of having come from academia is like you're constantly zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out. Even within like a single genre of industry or like a single application, there is so much amazing like detail and nuance, and especially in this space where we're treating streams that have otherwise like never touched a membrane before. And to be like, cool, like what happens when you do it?
Big boom.
With where we're trying to go, these completely non-standard waters. If we said no to everything that raised a red flag, we wouldn't be MembrIon.
Because we're treating wastewater often, the client can't always give us the level of detail we need to model it accurately.
All right, then, keep your secrets.
I did try to benchmark a lot of our waters with like polymeric membranes because we're like, hey, let's make our case study. And I did melt some polymer membranes because I put them in an oxidizer stream and it was just like, oh, bye-bye. It's gone.
A lot of where we focus is on acidic wastewaters that contain regulated metals.
The semiconductor wastewater, like acidic metals, that we are very well suited for, especially when we consider that like we can handle oxidizers. We're not going to throw a fit if there's chelators present, which is true for most semiconductor like waste streams because they're trying to prevent corrosion. And so they're going to add a bunch of stuff which act as chelating agents. And so because of our like ceramic backbone, that's going to be less of a challenge necessarily because it's not going to stick as much because it's unlike interactions.
These are streams that are toxic both for humans and the environment. They're challenging to dispose of, and correspondingly their treatment and disposal costs are astronomical. And beyond just the treatment aspect of it, for the most part, a lot of the actual materials in these streams have intrinsic value, and that value gets lost. You have streams that have copper, nickel, cobalt, things that are really important for the clean energy transition that in many cases are too dilute to be of any value from a recapture standpoint. And how do we then make sure that concentrate stream gets returned back to the value chain and reused? We absolutely have competitors in the space, not so much on the emerging side, but lots on the existing side.
When we realized that we could just compete in this other space, that was like a really important realization. We're trying to prioritize those projects. We're obviously have other technologies that we're competing against, right? Like chemical precipitation, traditional ion exchange, that sort of stuff. So it's like that competition still exists, but it's very different, and like we can unlock certain efficiencies, I think, that would otherwise be hard to access.
So we predominantly compete with a lot of chemical suppliers. So anyone who's, providing lime, caustic, things like that are happening in a chemical coagulation process, flocculants. And then we typically compete against waste disposal companies, people who are actually trucking the liquid or the sludge off-site.
When you're trucking it, you're beholden to that cost. You're beholden to that company that's taking your waste away. If they don't turn up, you're going to have a problem. If the surcharge changes because the petrol prices change, that's going to be rolled through. It makes that pricing very inconsistent.
We sit right at this unique interface between these two industries, which are actually quite discrete in their offerings. And I think that that's part of our strategy. I think that when companies can grow to something really significant, that disruption is a lot easier when there's already a line in the sand that's been drawn. And so we're able to kind of help jam a wedge in there and provide a distinct offering that neither of those other sides can provide wholly on their own, so that we're able to offer something truly distinct. And then it has to obviously be something that the customer wants if they're going to adopt it.
So how do you figure out what a customer wants? Well, it's time to find out and ask them.
The tech clearly worked, but they need to find somebody who would buy it. What's the market look like? What's that client look like? And at that point, everything else added up, but that's the part there that I think Greg struggled with as well.
For me, coming from outside the industry, my assumption is that everybody else is going to know how to deploy this better than we will. We are the newbies. We're coming in. We're doing something really different. We should be working with people that are a lot more knowledgeable than us. And I don't think that that's a flawed assumption, but it ended up being one that really slowed us down, because what we found is because the industry is so risk adverse, we were just adding another layer of risk aversion to a new process. Instead of MembrIon going to an end customer and saying, how do we prove this to you? We would have to prove it to a channel partner or an integrator first, and then they would have to get comfortable enough to put their name on it and prove it to their customer. And so what we found is that process was just way, way slower than us going directly to the end user and saying, you've got a problem, we can solve your problem, let's figure out how to solve this.
It's really cool to have a tech that does all kinds of wild and wonderful things. But make no mistake, in the water and wastewater industry, it's a slow-moving animal. There isn't one client out there that wakes up at 6 a.m., sets his alarm, jumps out of bed, rockets to the office to write a purchase order for a piece of treatment kit. I mean, that just doesn't happen. People buy equipment in this industry because they have to, not because they want to.
Especially in water, you've got to be tied to the person with the pain. We looked at it very much from an execution strategy. If we don't know how to do this, we need the right partners. Those partners will help introduce us to the people that have the pain, and you just end up with layers of abstraction and difficulty really understanding where you need to go and what you need to improve and how things work. Getting to that end user faster would have dramatically sped up our learning process. Who knows, we got to the same place, but we would have gotten there way faster by connecting directly with the person with the pain, as opposed to the person who says oh yeah, I know someone with this pain and this is what their pain is.
So I am hopping on more initial sales calls to try and be able to have those conversations and just see it from them and not necessarily have everything filtered.
For it to be effective, I think you actually need to be at kind of a senior leader level within the organization. You will find all sorts of pain points when working with engineers, operators, operators, facility directors. But when you get kind of above that level, the pain gets like an order of magnitude bigger. Is the facility at risk of millions of dollars in fine? Are they losing the opportunity? Could they be generating more revenue than they are today if they didn't have these bottlenecks? Those are the pains that get things moving fast.
Which is when Greg got me thinking, wait, wouldn't trucks dumping wastewater somewhere remote be a pain for ESG or sustainability executives at the companies MembrIon is targeting? I mean, from an external eye, reading press releases and annual reports, it sounds like a driving force, right?
I wish that was the case. Behind closed doors, what you would hear from a lot of kind of the people that are in charge of ESG is they have very little power to enact change in the organization. When times are good and there's extra money to go around, they get money to be able to do things. When times are tighter, they're one of the first ones that get cut. They can be the person that gives you access to that executive because they often sit on that senior leadership team. It's not to say that they aren't an incredibly important person in the process. They're just unlikely to be the person that is like truly experiencing the pain that's going to drive this system.
See, that's why Greg is right. You should always aim for real-life, field-proven inputs and not solely rely on word of mouth or marketing-controlled press releases. Now, addressing the person with the real pain, that's a necessary condition. But is it sufficient to get our water tech flying off the shelves?
If something's not broken, why fix it?
Water's kind of stagnant, I think. And I know that you talk to all of the new companies, but for me, you walk into a facility and they want to do what they've done before, they want to do what's safe, they want to do what is easy. It's that aversion to risk. Nobody got fired for doing the same old thing, right? People get fired when they take a risk, do something new.
Even when we're able to offer cost savings, those cost savings have to be meaningful enough for a company to do something about it.
Which, if you're familiar with these concepts we regularly addressed on this channel, would be a value-driven innovation.
So often where we've found the fit is the status quo has changed. There's a regulation that's coming into place, and all of a sudden, the existing process isn't able to keep up with that change.
In which case, I guess you saw that one coming. You would now have a crisis-driven innovation. Remember, crisis-driven gets you adopted twice faster than value-driven. If you want a refresher, I've linked you the short and long explanations in the bookmarks and the description.
One big one that's shown up in lots of different areas of the US is selenium, for example. That's becoming increasingly more regulated at the EPA level for sure, and then those get passed down to municipalities, and then inevitably a lot of them say, well, let's pass it into industry, and that's a particularly challenging one for a lot of technologies to treat, not for us. A change in regulation creates a pain point that has to be addressed for that facility to continue to operate. Water's highly subsidized, it's cheap, and so trying to get an ROI on more water recycling, better technology there is really hard, but when you're comparing it to a facility's ability to operate and generate revenue, the value of water is quite high, and it's very easy to get simple paybacks on those.
Which leads us to the final piece in the puzzle, a business model pivot.
From a business model standpoint, how do we take on just the risk of we may or may not be here in 2 years because we're a venture-backed company? That's where we really saw the opportunity with a service model.
What's the fastest route to satisfying a market that's hesitant?
Instead of being a module producer, we'd like to be a water as a service. And that's really where we think we add the value. Instead of having a capital expenditure heavy sale, you're basically saying, well, yes, I'm signing up and partnering with you in order to get water treated, but I'm not having to outlay this capital.
We're able to deploy our systems with a simple dollar per treated gallon. That's a performance guarantee.
The WSA helps manage risk. And I think the other thing that it does is it also gives us the space, like we have in the piloting, of figuring out like what's going wrong. And because it's a water service agreement, the customer knows that we are incentivized to solve all the problems that we're going to encounter. That helps us go a little bit faster because I think that also helps build the trust and mitigate the risk.
It removes that cost barrier to entry so that we can implement that technology faster on a shorter sales cycle with that customer, get it in place, get it operating, get it producing the water on spec or recovering the metals for them so that they can see it work.
And what we found is that when you strip away all those risks and you're lower cost than what exists, you can move at a very different pace. And accordingly, we had to go out and we raised asset financing in between our last round, which has given us the ability to not just draw on investor dollars to deploy this. So we have other sources of capital to be able to do that.
And the debt financing is sort of on that high single digit, low double digit rate of return for the lender, but it's something that still allows us to have a growing business. And eventually what you'd like to do is get your flywheel turning where you're basically making enough revenue within your own group to fund your next, platforms as you roll them out, your next systems.
That was a big shift for us, was thinking about how do we go from trying to bulletproof a module and understand all of the things you can and can't do to it, to how do we want to operate our systems to best showcase what our module can do, but really just be adaptable to these streams. And so before we could not care so much about, what happens when the salinity spikes by 30%. That was going to be someone else's problem, and they had a tool they could deal with it. And so that was exactly the kind of questions that, we started talking really closely to our customer success engineers who were out in the field doing pilot demonstrations, because in some ways we were always doing that system work and then really taking ownership of that's going to be ours forever now. So let's make sure that we're asking the right questions and getting the right data so that we're setting up these systems with all the intelligence and coding to handle that.
If I were to change the mark from the one that you had referred to, at this point, I would say where they're positioned is, an 8.5 out of 10. The future's still not clear, but there's a feeling that it's no longer hope. Hope isn't the plan. I hope we can get this, and I hope we're able to enter that market. They know how to do it now.
I think it's difficult to see a clean switch between what we did and what we're doing now, because we have been evolving the business strategy over the last 6 months. But for sure, it's a lot of interest from customers.
When we walk it through with people, we get buy-in pretty easily, but there's still a lot of decision makers in the process that have to all sign off, and they all have to agree that this is worth the effort of doing it. Is this a big enough problem that this is where we want to put our time, even if we're not having to sink capital into it?
Why is it not a no-brainer? I'd say it's that stagnation in the industry, that it's easier to just keep doing what you're doing. It's easier to just stick the water on a truck and then it goes away.
One of the first things we get asked is like, oh, this is really interesting. Is there someone we can go talk to that's been doing this for a while, that's ideally close by our facility and ideally is in doing the same exact thing that we're doing? They want to know, like, well, my contaminants are different, my process is different. How do I know that this is going to work? Now, we point out that if we don't work, you just go back to the piece of equipment that you have installed. And so the risk is well mitigated, but there's still a risk there and there's still effort that goes into it.
Seeing is believing. When a customer sees the technology work in front of them, for us, it's easy, right? Because you have a feed conductivity and you have an outlet conductivity. And when one comes in high and it goes out low, and then you have the concentrate, then you can't deny that the system's working. And then you can back it up with the boring slow test where you're taking a water sample and sending out to a lab and doing the analysis on copper or whatever metal that we're targeting or that customer's targeting.
Now, so far, we've heard Alex Crowell from PureTerra Ventures, but actually, while PureTerra was leading the Series B round, more investors hopped on board, like for instance, Samsung Ventures Investment, which can be an interesting indirect reference, right?
We know that MembrIon is treating copper wastewater in the semiconductor industry, and Samsung is one of the largest generators of this waste. MembrIon's probably onto something if they're writing a check, right? So I think that there is a certain level of validation that's come, and I think that the nice thing and almost shocking thing about the semiconductor industry, it's surprising how collaborative that industry is when it's not talking about the chip architecture. They're all cutthroat when it comes to that. But when you get to the waste side and they're like, how are we going to deal with this? People are like, well, this is what we're doing. And it's very open. And so I think from that standpoint, with where we sit in that value chain and who our particular corporates are with Samsung and Lam Research, those have both been phenomenal additions to our cap table.
Now, even though, as Greg just explained, semiconductor manufacturers may be willing to openly discuss stuff one with another when it comes to their wastewater, sharing names, projects, and locations, especially when you're also disclosing pollutants and treatment streams, can be tricky from a PR perspective. That's where MembrIon came up with a very clever way to speed up and simplify referral. Something you may well be inspired to copy and apply yourself.
One of the provisions that we have in the contracting process is a basically ability to create a case study, mutually beneficial. That does show up in the contract, and we have a conversation about it if someone pushes back. So with a lot of these, we are, as we're deploying them, these things will be available and we will have the opportunity to share names, results, all of that stuff. We're just a few months out from being able to do that.
Okay, so now that we've filled up the rocket's tank with the Series B, gathered a crew to pilot it, zeroed in on the customer's true pains, and pivoted the business model to reduce friction to the bare minimum, it's time for a life-changing event, MembrIon's first commercial-size order. Life-changing is an incredible achievement, but it can also reveal bittersweet.
In startups, it's a weird feeling because we have these super high highs, but they're always right adjacent to a low low. It's really hard to truly celebrate a win because something is going to go wrong the next day, the next week. Yeah, super high, first system deployed, operating, will be a great reference customer at the end of the day, but major changes to the team. Bittersweet is a good way to put it. We did have partnerships in place. We did have relationships in place. We had where we were going to market. We had built a team around a thought of where we might end up in the market. And when you choose to focus, you have to go through the realization that you are going to have to change some things. And some of that process is really painful. One of the things that I was afraid of at the beginning is like, are we going to have to change foundational members of the team? And part of that answer was yes. We made a lot of foundational changes to the team because where we were going, we did not have the right people on board where we were going. And so we had to make changes.
What do we need to do to make sure the company is successful over the next 2 years? The people that departed were very, very skilled. I mean, some of our best people. But for example, 2 of them were on the infrared camera project. Very successful completion of their tasks, but not something that was going to get us where we need to go over the next 2 years. And they're very employable.
I'm very much a people person. I love the people that I work with. It's the perk of being the boss. I get to choose everyone who's around me. But the reality is, to have to say like, okay, well, because we're going in a different direction, you no longer have the skills to be able to get us where we're going. We have to make that change. Those are super hard decisions. It was the first time that I had to fire someone just because it didn't fit the strategy. And that, I think in particular, was really, really hard because this is someone who's done phenomenal work with the company for years, lots of patents. We would not be here without this person, and yet fundamentally that skill set was not one that we would need to rely on moving forward. As much as I hate it, that's kind of the ruthlessness of business, is that at the end of the day, we do need to make sure we have the right people in the right seats, and we didn't need that seat anymore, and we had other seats that we had to fill.
You always want to be aware of the human impact of making these changes, but the CFO role is really thinking about what is the best decision for the company and how do we make sure that our next 12 months, our next 24 months roadmap is met. And in that case, it's going to be, we need a few more people in sales, and quite bluntly, we needed a few more people in operations. And in order to get that done, you have to shrink elsewhere.
At the end of the day, there were kind of 3 different positions that we wound down, and we hired 6 more people. Net increase of the company, but really hard changes that came in the process. If I didn't have to make, I wouldn't want to, but at the end of the day, burn rate it comes for all of us as a startup. Until we're profitable, we don't have the luxury of having, the wrong people on board, so.
Building things for 1 or 2 and using your R&D group to help build those is very different than saying we need to build 15 of these at once.
It really just involved us leaning into one of our core values as a company is all in this together. And that was just an absolute theme during that time where, our operations was very lean because before we had big orders, there was no reason to have a big ops team. And so when that order came through and we did have to really, focus on that, luckily we helped develop a lot of those processes, right? How do we manufacture the membranes? How do we load the modules? So we were ready to step in. Like I said, it was really just showcasing and reminding everyone that this is our value as a company. And it doesn't matter who's on what team, we're all trying to get this, they make this order successful and this install successful.
And R&D, that's not what they signed up for. That's not what brings them joy, is coming in every day. Our operations team, what they're very interested in is how can we come in and make the same thing better every day, but they're not worried about, I want to publish a paper necessarily. It's just a different expectation with your self-worth and what you think of as your job. And I think both of them have very valid purposes. And what we'd like to do and what we continue to try to do is separate separate them so that the operations team feels they're well suited and they have enough resources to do everything they need to do on a standard day-to-day. But if any problem comes up, they have somebody in R&D, somebody in the product development team they can talk to and get that help, that extra help that they need.
There's a gentle tension between the teams, right? The sales team is always going to be pushing forward. They're always going to be going. They're always going to be stretching. They're always going to be reaching. And then you've got the product development or R&D and application engineering, which are probably pulling back.
It's tough because, sure, there's part of me that wants to stick with what's standard, but I'm just as excited as they are when they bring a whole new stream that's like tons of acid, tons of, weird metals that have all sorts of crazy redox potentials. Like, I get excited looking at that too. So the real struggle for me is being able to rein in their excitement, my excitement, the 1,000 ideas running through my head of how could we make it work? What if we do this? What if we change that component? And instead put that, into a nice list of things and a plan and figure out when we can tackle that. And I think that's really, the tension is not saying necessarily no, but later.
With the first commercial unit out of the door, it's now time for the new internal structure to gear itself towards replicating that first success.
In order to go into a strong growth mode, we need to make sure that we're not letting perfect get in the way of good enough.
At the beginning, we were very much research. We were doing a lot of fundamental research. And we are very much moving into development. And, right now, even my team, from when I took this role on, I was director of R&D, and now I'm director of product development. And so it really is moving into, what it is we're focusing on, what the goals are. It's maybe not a brand new membrane chemistry, and now it is, how are we integrating this in here? Do we have the right control narrative to make sure we're handling all the variants in the streams correctly?
For most of this technology, most of the new technology you have out there, you have to have it out with the customer and working to see their pain points. They need to be using our equipment and telling us how to improve it rather than us sitting in the lab, we'll just need another year to really work on this process and get it a little better, or give us another year and we'll make it a little easier to connect these valves or whatever.
I love the constrained environment because otherwise, if you just let yourself follow curiosity, you can keep yourself entertained for decades and at the end of it have very little to show the world for it.
You have to get out there and you have to be exposed to the market pressure as well as the, very blunt feedback from the end users.
Our sales directors are great. They'll go talk to people or people will approach us and talk to them. And we start with a water quality analysis. And so kind of from that library that I built of here's all the species that we've encountered and how we're going to interact with them of we know this or we don't know this, but here's our assumptions of how it'll interact. That sets our application engineering team up really well to be able to screen the water quality and say yes, we should get a water sample and we should test it in-house, or we're really not going to be a good fit. So once it gets through our applications engineering, yes, no. And so generally what we'll do is we'll ask for either them to send us a water sample here at MembrIon, or we've built a small little benchtop kit that we can throw in a suitcase, fly to the site, set it up in a day, run a bunch of benchtop tests, and then come back and look at the results. And so from there, once we say okay, we've done the bench test, we've shown that we can treat it, we've shown that it's economical to treat because we'll get some preliminary sizing information from that test. We'll go to the customer and figure out what would a water service arrangement look like? If the stream is small enough, we'll actually just go straight into the water service agreement. It's hey, why don't we just say the first 6 months of this are going to be a trial, and that'll help build the confidence.
One of the things that we've gotten really clear on is, what are the things that we need to be able to measure so that we can continue to get better at those things?
It's more about implementing processes and implementing documentation. When you run into a problem, the first thing to do is you ask, is there a process? And if there's not, you change that. And then if there is a process, is the process being followed? And then if that's the case, is the process sufficient to close a gap or remove a fault?
We are an earlier stage company. We don't have a huge breadth of installs. So we are, to a certain extent, doing everything for the first time. So this allows us to practice, build our SOPs, build our processes, make sure they're in place, challenge them, polish them, improve them, so that the next one is better, the one after that is better, the one after that is better.
We've been manufacturing membranes for 3 years. We now know what our yields are. Previously, it's you have scrap, right? Of course you have scrap. Not everything is going to be exactly the way you want. We have to cut things to shape. It was always taken for granted there's a certain amount of scrap. Well, once we started measuring it, we were oh man, there's way more than we should have. And we were able to significantly reduce that and, of course, correspondingly, that helps our efficiency from output from production and what we can handle, and our margins and all those sorts of things get positively impacted. That's one example of kind of dozens of metrics that we put in place.
When I came in, I think they had built all of maybe one of these INX 1000s to be able to share with a customer. By the end of Q2, we had shipped 15. So we basically ramped up very quickly, and it was stressful. And so it's really keeping that sort of sense of these problems are hard, but we know we can get through it. And if it's process driven, my mantra is always, you need to be hard on the problem and not on the people. And so you always look to like, where can we improve a process, and not say, well, it's just because they don't know what they're doing. It's because we haven't helped them understand what good looks like.
We're early stage. We have not so many systems in the field. We have one deployed at a semiconductor manufacturer, which is running fantastic. And there's a gentleman down there called Brandon who's doing a superb job of operating that system. We have a system we're deploying into a metal plating facility and special chemical in this quarter. So we're putting another 2 systems out in the next quarter. At the moment, we're pretty much 1-to-1 on our systems, 1 operator to 1 system. Moving forward, it's very much in the plan to go 2-to-1 and then 4-to-1, incorporating more automation into our systems so that we can operate remotely or operate less manually, was a conversation I had with that customer and Brandon last week. And it's, can we start to move this to remote operation? And what does that look like? So it moves to, rather than Brandon pressing the button on the HMI, it's Brandon controlling the system with a laptop stood next to the system. And then it's Brandon being at the desk that's been allocated for him at that facility, operating it so that he's a 2-minute walk away from the system. And then it's Brandon operating that system from home locally. And then it's, can we move operation back to MembrIon? So we're operating it here from Seattle. 2-to-1 is coming up in 2025, 2026, and 4-to-1 is beyond that.
I think it's really, connecting the dots to the impact we're having in this second phase. Now that we're out there, they get to see the water we're treating and see the customers we're serving. Something, I've switched to doing is, instead of mapping everything out precisely for 3 years, we do a lot of quick, short sprints. And then a way that I've added a metric into my team is just an impact score. At the end of every month, we share a variety of impacts, which is, some are planned projects and here's the result. And sometimes it's customer success brought us this question, I figured it out, and then they did this, and we give it an impact score. And so we kind of get to celebrate as a team the ways that we're making impact, even if it's not part of, the 3-year roadmap.
We work with a number of partners. We are likely closing that down to 1 main supplier, and we're actually working through a standard ECD system design at the moment so that we can really engineer that system, incorporate the learnings from our piloting and from the early installs and early systems that we have out there. Then we can standardize on that design, and then we can scale that system, right?
Do you share that optimism?
Yes, I do. I think we will have a standard product by October. Yeah. We're going to have that standard system. We can have a standard product. I believe that will happen in October.
Positive thinking.
We're getting a lot better at saying no to things. There's a lot of things that are really shiny objects, and I still get excited, but I'm getting better at being able to say nope. We actually just finished our leadership quarterly offsite this last weekend, and we came in there with, I think there were 22 different priorities that were on the list, and we walked out with 12 and a top 5. Basically, the top 5 are the 5 that have to happen. The next 7 are the nice to haves, and the other 10 chopped. We're just not going to do.
Well, lesson learned.
We're in contracting now on a facility that we didn't have to pilot at. We were able to just do bench scale testing. And with the contract structure, we're able to say look, this is no risk to you. We give you a 120-day opt-out on the front end. If you don't like it, we'll pull it out and we can put it somewhere else because it's a standard system. One of those priorities is that our customer walks away from that commissioning process excited to do another project with us. We want that process of commissioning the system to not just go well. We want it to be at a point where they're like, wow, that was so easy. Let's do this again. That's going to kick off in about 30 days for us, where we'll be commissioning that second system. And so that's a priority for us as a company. So everyone knows it's all hands on deck as we're doing that. Doesn't matter where you are in the organization. If you have a way to impact that, then that's a key focus for us.
And that somewhat closes an arc. The Series B has taken MembrIon out of the piloting mode and enabled the company to put its ducks in a row and successfully ship out its first references. They're on the verge of standardizing their solution and get ready to scale. But to do so, it's time to open a new arc, the Series C.
The way that we look at the Series C is when we invested in the B, this is what it was all for, is to get them ready for the Series C. Our initial investment, we're the lead investor. We step in, we try to position the company, do the best we can so that they can get a significant follow-on round, and we will participate in that round. So the way we set up our investments, we have dry powder there for that portfolio company. It's a good sign as well for MembrIon if Pure Terra Ventures is the lead of the last round and a major investor in the company follows on, interested in following on in the next round.
Series C, it's expansion. We know what's sticking. We have contracts signed and operating. We've got multiple more deals that are in contracting. It's how do we scale this effectively?
Assuming we are successful in our raise, certainly as you said, we're getting our standard product, and then that'll be like a 30 GPM system. The next kind of nearest term thing is increasing our module flow capacity so that then we can build a 100 GPM system, standard system. A 100 GPM system lets us go into new verticals. A mining company isn't going to talk to us at 30 GPM. They might not talk to us at 100 GPM, but at least we could do a pilot. But I think semiconductor, there's some applications where the 30 GPM is right and some where they'll want the 100 GPM.
We've got a really great core team, but we don't have the bandwidth to do the level of business that is coming through our pipeline. Great problem to have. We don't have a formal sales leader. That's something that right now I'm heavily involved in that process. I'm not a salesperson. I'm an engineer. I guarantee that there are people that with our capabilities could do far better, far faster than I could. We don't have a marketing team. I know that there are people who could communicate what we're doing and help us focus even better than what we're doing today. So I think I'm really excited as we add some of these key functionalities to the team that we know we need. And right now we're kind of, pinch hitting for adding those in. I think that's what gets me excited about saying, okay, yeah, we're just missing a few pieces of the puzzle to really pour gas on the fire.
So it's Q4 2024 and MembrIon is about to pour gas on that fire to repeat what Greg just said. Let's now look forward. How does MembrIon look like in 2030?
By 2030, MembrIon will be a global company doing at least 50 million in ARR.
We should have recurring revenue in the $30 to $60 million range.
Generating majority of the revenue from WSA installations, operating systems.
Annual recurring revenue, of course, on multiples for exit fall into a different category than a product sales technology. So once it really gets north of 10 million, that's the golden number that companies become a lot more attractive, especially on exit value. And you also, when you get up to 50, your number of acquirers is getting pretty small. There's a sweet spot there for VC that you want a company to grow to, not too small, not too large.
That is a clear set goal that we have as a company. Starting from where we are today, we are right at about 1 million. It's a growth story.
I hope that we're still being curious about new ways that we can get value out of our wastewater. So I think that we will be, by 2030, we're going to have a ton of solid products in the field. And I hope that we are not satisfied.
I've always seen the water market as having a slow adoption rate, but once it happens, they really do dig into it. And so I think that's, 2030 is not that far, granted. And so I think our best efforts are going to be focusing on whether it's semiconductor or the metal etch, metal processing, potentially batteries, focusing on some subsets of the industry where we really can get good penetration for that.
And is there anything that can prevent MembrIon from being successful?
The thing that can prevent us from being successful is really our recruiting, fundamentally. If we get the right people in place, it's almost a foregone conclusion that the success will follow.
If we look at our ramp rate, we have extremely high confidence with all our employees now. If you 10x that number of employees, how do you keep the company culture? How do you keep everything working smoothly?
The culture of a company we don't want to tear down. And that's a quick way of tearing down culture is to take something that's been, organically grown to this point. It has great legs. It just needs some run room, some experience, some installations. Then we can backfill that.
That scaling, I think, is where many of the small companies, I wouldn't say they lose their soul, but it's a very difficult transition.
Will people want circularity in the right place at the right time to catch us when we need to catch it? I think that's always such a huge challenge with any sort of starting technology is getting that alignment of the planets, if you would. And I think there's things that we can do to address that by being like making sure we keep our head up and like going, like improving our marketing, all that kind of stuff. But I think that's probably the biggest barrier.
So that means that if MembrIon is hitting its growth targets, you will have to think of an exit.
Yes, this company hits 8, 9, 10 million in annual recurring. That's where we would be probably fairly active in looking for an exit for this technology.
Could MembrIon have a channel partnership that gives us global reach with a big integration company? Yeah, I think those could exist. Could we be acquired by one? Absolutely. That's always on the table. My investors would be furious if I said otherwise.
Maybe. I don't know. For ourselves, 3 to 4 years from now would be a comfortable period for exit. The best way to put it, I guess, for you would be for a very large sum of money, and the plan towards that and the participants will just, Antoine, I'll leave it at a to be announced.
Fundamentally, MembrIon's purpose is to create circularity of critical resources. That is what we are here to do.
Unlocking circularity in places where people thought it was impossible.
There's only upside for the customer because it's going to allow us to access that circularity so they can save water or recover their metals.
We're bringing circularity to the wastewater industry.
Circularity, I think. And that maybe is one you've heard a few times, but that really is what's exciting about this to me.
We're taking what was thought of as a pure waste stream and we're dividing it into, do you want more fresh water in your facility? Do you want to recover your metals and reuse them? Or do you want potentially to reuse the acids? But it's really the circularity argument is going to be where we don't have a green premium, we're not charging more, you're actually saving money and you're getting resources back.
What's really interesting and getting a lot of attention these days is capture. How do we take that brine stream that typically is still viewed as a waste, but then instead of looking at that as waste is how can we get the value out of what's in there? So that idea of brine mining, and especially since we're in, semiconductor, you just look at all that copper. Trucking it offsite just seems like such a waste. So the next step is how do we capture that? Not just copper, but metals like nickel or cobalt. And how do we get that back into the economy?
I'm a nerd for circular economies. I'm really excited about how this technology can enable circular economies and really figure out, like, within that technical cycle, if we're thinking about the MacArthur Foundation model, we have all these like really valuable like non-renewable resources and all these minerals, and they end up in water, and we have to figure out how to do something with it. So I think it's the thought that with what MembrIon is doing and where we're going is that we can be in that picture and like helping enable that reality really excites me.
The bigger the vision, the easier it's going to be. And it's, I think, really important for young entrepreneurs to know is, especially when raising venture capital, no one wants to bet on a small vision. No one wants to bet on a really successful operating company that's growing at 30% year over year. They want to bet on the thing that could change the world. If you're not interested in that vision and not presenting that vision, it just is a lot harder to do the same set of activities that you're going to do either way. Like, Greg, you got to think bigger, keep thinking bigger.
How can you not be excited about that? That's just cool. And also it's just the right thing to do.
Talking of the right thing to do, if you've enjoyed this episode and this new format, it's a lot of work, it's fun to do, but it's a lot of work. Did I already say that? Yet I believe that the openness with which the MembrIon team shared their path is truly inspirational for many more growth stage water tech companies. So I'm willing to produce more of those with the immense power of my one-man band. That's where I need you. Please support me by taking this episode and warmly recommend it to your friends, your colleagues, your boss or your team. And because I'm always interested in getting to know who's been with me until the end, here's a second ask. Just put Josh's last sentence in the comments. Simply write down, it's the right thing to do. Because it's the right thing to do, right? And see you next time.